Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Converging OT and IT Networks, Where and How to Evolve ICS for Security, sponsored by Nozomi Networks, Radiflow, and Yokogawa. My name is Carol Auth of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Doug Wylie, Director, SANS Industrials and Infrastructure Practice, and he will be moderating today's webcast. Barbara Filkins, Research Director, SANS Analyst Program, Kim Legelis, CMO, Nozomi Networks, Ilan Barda, Founder and CEO of Radiflow, and Camilo Gomez, Global Cybersecurity Strategist at Yokogawa. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Doug.
Thank you so much, Carol. I really appreciate the kickoff, and I want to be the first one to say just how excited I am to have this opportunity today to be meeting with so many of you that are taking time out of your important schedules to talk about the topics that we're going to cover throughout this webcast. Also want to extend very strong gratitude to our sponsors of today's webcast, Nozomi, Radiflow, and Yokogawa. The level of support that they provided for the information that we're going to be bringing to you today was outstanding, very instrumental at giving us an opportunity to conduct the research and to bring that to the surface. And as already introduced, Kim, Ilan, and Camilo are friends and security professionals and esteemed colleagues of both mine and Barb's, and we're so pleased that they're joining us today. So as we proceed, we wanted to kick off today's conversation with our panelists to reflect on all the change that continues to occur in industry. None of us are immune to this. You know, we talk about this topic continually, just how much connectivity has entered the equation for organizations with their control systems, and those control systems in factory environments, out in the field, running building automation systems, and just every corner that we look, we continue to see control systems pervasively entering our lives and delivering tremendous value to what we want to achieve with our businesses and civilization, to be honest with you. It's important to keep in mind that for organizations today, there's all these benefits and risks that come as technology marches forward, as connectivity continues to expand. And we like to look at those types of conditions both outwardly and inwardly, because each one of these is applying pressure in a different way to organizations today as they continue to work towards their business imperatives. We see hyperconnectivity everywhere. The control systems of today have greatly expanded in the number of devices, the intelligence of those devices, the level of visibility that they're providing into operations to improve productivity and efficiency, but also to provide much higher degrees of connectivity and accessibility. You know, all of this is enabling us to do incredible things with today's control systems as part of the operational technology environment. There's also inward pressures as well. If we think about IT-OT convergence, the foundations around convergence aren't just collapsing the technologies, it's to extract many benefits that come by integrating these different environments. Access to that information, as mentioned, for productivity and efficiency, but it also helps us take a rational view at our suppliers, at the mixture of different devices, at how we harmonize the duties and responsibilities of individuals that are working with these systems to design, install, and operate over time. And also the shared budget elements here of having enough resources to maintain these systems and really take advantage of them over time. So we're privileged in many respects in the industrial control operating technology space that as it continues to mature, you know, we see many of the themes that we read about all the time, like cloud services, big data, machine learning, artificial intelligence. Many of the foundations for these these types of investments actually had a start in industrial control so many years ago. So it's not necessarily new technology in many respects when we look at those. It gives us that great opportunity to understand how that has evolved over time so we can make improvements as we move forward. So today's webcast is going to focus a lot around that risk management aspect of how it affects operational technology and contemporary industrial control systems. We're going to talk a lot about those successful interactions between process, technology, people, and also this extended life cycle that we have to keep in mind with all control systems. The foundations that you'll see in some of the data points we share come from a survey we just conducted around the state of OT ICS cybersecurity. You can find that paper at that link, and it will be posted as well. We had a number of responders from many different geographies, different job roles, different responsibilities, and organizations provide data to give us some of these insights. And we welcome you to also download this paper, and please do draw your own conclusions as you evaluate the results from that paper. So I'm going to be handing this over to Barb, and she's going to lead us through the panel discussions, and you can see the format that we're going to follow. So again, thank you for joining, and Barb, I'm handing it to you now.
Okay, thank you, Doug. And what we're going to basically do is discuss 4 questions and cover 3 discussion areas that we kind of highlighted in the paper. One has to do with architecture. The next has to do with the actual investment, which is more than just a budget, but then we'll circle back and look at how those impact cybersecurity budgets and plans for today. And for each one, I'm going to direct it to one of our sponsors, and our last question, we'll have an open forum on it, and then we'll open it up to attendee Q&A. With that, I'd like to go on to the next slide, and this is our first observation. Most of us traditional security people think of things in terms of boundaries. If you look at most of the, I'd say, best practices such as NIST, it talks about setting up a system boundary and then defining your system security plan relative to that boundary. Well, in terms of the IT and OT, in the past, it's been fairly traditional, at least for fixed assets, where there would be a fairly well-defined physical boundary. But we're finding that there's moving edges, porous boundaries, and the use of clouds. More than 40% of the respondents, for example, in our survey are using cloud-based services for OT-based service functions. And basically the interpretation is that the logical layer is becoming more important than the physical layer in establishing the risks presented by OT ICS systems and then being able to mitigate it. Boundaries are moving, assets are becoming virtualized. In looking at the actual data, approximately 78% of the OT or control systems have an external connection, and 34% of those systems are connecting directly to the internet, either directly or through their DMZ. So the discussion point is, what does this mean for ICS network visibility and overall risk management of the OT domain? Well, it's also interesting, there's a couple of points from our survey where about 62% of our audience felt that they really knew what their boundary was cleanly, but that when you look at the internals, only about 35% were confident that they had some knowledge of the assets within those boundaries, which kind of leads to a dichotomy. And the other thing about boundaries is if you look at the critical and the CIS controls, the top 3 families have to deal with being able to know what your inventory of hardware and software are and what those configurations are to maintain security. So there's some dichotomies or disjoints in what we saw in the survey. So going forward, what I'd like to do is I'd like to get Kim's inputs on this particular observation from our survey results. Kim?
Yes, thank you, Barbara. I appreciate the introduction. And I want to just pause for a moment, though, and say thank you for the good work that SANS does in the ICS space. That SANS has been a thought leader and conducting this survey for a long time. And I think one of the most interesting things about the work that SANS does, in addition to training vast amounts of folks to become cybersecurity professionals in ICS, which I think we all know is a very, very important thing for the advancement of that practice, is that you've done this survey for several years. So the difference year over year in the survey and in the marketplace overall, I think is an interesting point that I won't diverge onto now, but did want to just recognize the good work that you've done, I think, for over a decade now as a pioneer in training people in the ICS community. So I think that's a service that we're all thankful for. Regarding the findings in this observation, it's a few things were surprising to me. That the number was that 40% are using cloud-based services. That I think was higher than I would have anticipated based on Nozomi Networks interface with thousands of sites deployed using technology that does visibility and detection just inside the industrial control system. And that's a pretty high number. So, but it does really jive with the findings and the trends for hyperconnectivity, which is of course driven by the desire to have productivity and efficiency. That is all about the modernization of industrial control systems, right? Whether you're in the manufacturing space or a utility space or refining or transportation, digital transformation is an empowering endeavor that organizations are undertaking because of the benefits that it brings in productivity and efficiency, et cetera. But with that connectivity, of course, as your survey finds here, that connectivity also means that there's a porous border, right? Of all the systems, I think industrial control systems used to have a stronger border or a moat, if nonetheless, than other industries and other IT systems for sure, but that those boundaries are now becoming more and more porous. And what that means with respect to visibility, it reflects both on visibility and threats, of course, right? Because the connectivity creates additional attack surfaces that could affect the reliability and uptime of the processes that the control systems are operating, which is really the number one objective of a control system operator, is safety and reliability and uptime. And so it is a dichotomy in a different way, that the modernization of these systems demands connectivity, and that connectivity then in turn creates cyber risk. And I think that to manage cyber risk, you were talking about the visibility of assets earlier. You can't protect what you don't know you have, right? So one of the first steps in addressing the issue of connectivity is know what's in your network, know what's in your industrial control network, and know what it's connected to. So that's, I think, an extremely important part of the process of improving industrial control systems cybersecurity. And then in terms of managing overall risk to that network, you have to know a few things. Once you know what you have and what it's connected to, it makes a lot of sense to spend time doing detection. There's a lot of debate around detection versus protection and prevention. I think a porous border means that a detection is a must, right? That you have to know if there is the existence of known threats in your environment. But in the industrial control environment, you can also have the benefit of using behavioral-based anomaly detection to determine where the processes that are running in that environment are askew. Where are they off the baseline and why? And I know later in this webcast, we're going to talk a little bit about the nature of insider versus outsider threats to some extent. And having that kind of anomaly detection at the process level leads you to identify where the areas are where there might be a threat, regardless of its source. So I know I've said that's a lot of commentary on one slide, but connectivity is the driving force behind the additional exposure of the environment, and it's an important topic, I think, for discussion today.
I completely agree with you, Kim. And Camilo, I would be interested in where does Yokogawa see the edges of today's ICS lie? Especially in mobile space. Okay.
I think Camilo's looking for his mute button.
Excuse me, yes, looking for my mute button. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you loud and clear.
No, thank you. So echoing Kim's comments, I would also like to thank you, SANS, for your effort, for this survey, for your many years of engagement helping in educating, creating awareness, and getting some vision of what's going on in the industrial cybersecurity space. So regarding this moving the edge, this is a really important aspect where we all know that the physical security of the past based on that precisely physical is not there anymore. It's moving to the virtual. So we now have to or need to evolve. I guess we are also evolving our security into protecting the virtual boundaries, and that is very important for all organizations, for the industry in general to understand. But it's not only by moving that things that we need to do in the space that we not only need to have better monitoring and detection, of course, but we also need to be conscious that when we move to the edge, we need to move also the security to the inner components. Those components are moving now to higher exposure environments, and they need to be more secure. So we are also moving at the same time the security or increasing the security, embedding the security into the inner components, and that goes all the way to the components themselves, the devices, but also the software applications that are running on those devices, industrial components, industrial devices, industrial software applications, of course, in this case. So from that perspective, I think there's a movement around not only in general in the industrial automation industry environments, but also in the industrial standard organizations and efforts of new standards or architectures. An example of that I can give you is OPA, for example, the Open Process Automation Architecture, and where this element of securing the inner components is paramount in addition to securing and extending the connections to virtual boundaries. There's no doubt that we need to work better in securing the design of work on secure by design components, better software applications or secure applications, trust-based connectivity and communications to build secure OT domains that are now virtual and not anymore physical. And we need to do all this by having into account that the industrial operation space is actually a space where we have lots of legacy, and we need to have this ability to support both the new and the legacy. The legacy is going to be there for a long, long time. So we need to have, or the efforts that we're doing are in order to enable both the security of the legacy and the security of the new.
Thanks, Camilo. That's a really good point. I think we often get too focused on the fact that we're moving rapidly forward, but we still have this trail of historical systems out there that need protection as well. Lan, do you have anything further that you'd like to add to this topic?
Yeah, just a few comments from my side. I think that we see this kind of migration happening, and I think it's important in this sense that the OT security vendors cooperate with the IT security vendors in order to make sure that there is a hybrid solution that can address the threats that are coming through the cloud into the OT network. And another thing that I'm glad to see that this is happening so rapidly. I also think that this is a higher number than what I would have anticipated, but I think it also opens the door for the solutions that are also the security aspects that can be done through the cloud. There is a lot of benefits once you are moving to this kind of services-based solutions for the security. You can get much more insights from threat intelligence and so on if this is allowed to be through the cloud. So this is something that will also help improving the cybersecurity aspect.
Okay, thank you. Well, with that, let's move on to observation 2, which has to do more with looking for risk in all the wrong places, to kind of quote the song, the U.S. country western song. What we found is surveyed organizations are not really reaching into their ICS infrastructure to monitor assets considered to have the highest impact if exploited. And again, this is another inconsistency between the risk versus the impact of exploitation and what is actually being collected. This goes back to the fact that about 75% have inventoried their workstations and servers, which are considered the higher risk. But the inconsistencies start to fall when you move down the chain from those server assets into things that are more directly related to OT. For example, less than half have inventoried their control system devices and software applications, even though they may be considered at the highest, have the highest impact if exploited. And so the question becomes, back to that discussion on boundaries versus what's inside those boundaries. With moving edges and boundaries, are the risks associated with the embedded devices, those elements inside the boundaries or considered inside the boundaries, whether it be a physical boundary or a logical boundary, are those risks being adequately or not adequately considered? And so what I'd like to do in this case is I'd like to pass it over to Camillo for his thoughts on the subject, and then we'll bring in the other two panelists and maybe Doug to address this. Camillo?
Yeah, thank you, Barb. I think, well, this is one of the really most interesting pieces of the survey this year for me and for many others. Well, there are many aspects, but this one of the risk aspect is really important. And there are several things that we need to understand here when we talk about this observation in particular. The first one is to realize or to remember that risk is not only the product of impact, but also the product of the likelihood of the threat and the likelihood of the vulnerability. The product of all those, not just one alone. So it's interesting to see that a big portion, 60% of the respondents to the survey are seeing the servers running commercial OS as the highest risk. And also 1/3 of them are seeing them as the greatest impact into operations. So this is interesting because it's not only, we have the impression that these Windows systems are running only on the business side, but there have been slowly, and they have been used actually actively used in the lower levels of what we call levels, functional levels of the industrial space, right? Levels 2, 3, and others. And they are heavily used, and for a reason, if we have high risk here is because the perception of the end users or the asset owners or the people impacted by this is that there's probably a high likelihood, even though the impact seems to be small. But the fact that we are collecting information, monitoring in essence, collecting data for the prevention and protection of that environment, also the highest, is giving an indication that there's something of high risk, high vulnerability, likelihood, at least potentially, not necessarily in terms of impact. There's another observation I'd like to make here, and it's regarding to the connectivity to the control networks, right? That is rating the risk and impact about the same. 1/3 of all respondents are thinking that they do have equal risk and impact, high risk or greatest risk for them. And this is telling us it's something important because it's the connection to the control network or field control networks. This is important. So this is confirming the need, the trend within the business to actually get and collect more data for business decisions, better decisions from the field, from operations. So that is that, and it's becoming a threat. No wonder also, and it's some high level of monitoring and control monitoring, right? And then lastly, this element of the embedded devices, are they or not? And this is interesting because now the risk is low, but the impact is high. So the explanation why risk, if we put it in terms of likelihood, is because probably the likelihood is is becoming low. It's not very low, but it's becoming low, and rightly so, because if you think the industry in general, industrial automation in general, industrial control systems in general have been working for years now in securing their components, the embedded devices. So in fact, if you are aware with ICS Secure and the work they do, they have programs for securing embedded devices that have been running for years before the new standards, the new 62443-4-2 and the 4-1 have become public in the last year or so, right? So there are programs, there are components, industrial components that have been integrating security into them for several years, especially embedded devices. So that is giving a reflection that probably the work in reducing the vulnerabilities there. So I think an important observation for all of us to have right into account. And then the element that I want to also mention is that the discussion of risk has to do with many aspects. It's how you assess the risk, of course, but for your organization, risk and actually protection. Again, referring to new standards, the new protection levels security standard from ISA 6243-2-2, right, is talking about protection levels, and that is giving the idea that the element of maintenance of the control, security controls, people, process, and technology controls is very important. And the protection level increases as you do better monitoring and maintenance. So this is also expanding the idea for the previous subject and this subject, where we need to have better monitoring, but also maintenance. There are several organizations, of course, that are working and helping, us included, Yokogawa and many others, in helping customers and so on to understand better what is that risk, the overall risk, and the protection levels they currently have, and of course manage their security and help them understand their operational security services by integrating, the knowledge that the organizations have in terms of OT operations and being able to operate in or have OT fit for purpose security procedures and policies that are effective to help the organizations to maintain and to monitor the life cycle.
Okay, Camilo, thanks. And hold some of those thoughts when we get to observation 3. Kim, I'd like to ask your thoughts on this, since we had picked on you about connectivity. I'd be interested in your reactions here based on your comments from observation 1.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. Well, I think that it is interesting to be thinking about risk versus impact, and then where that monitoring is going on, which is obviously an important risk mitigation. But I think one of the elements that is also apparent in looking at this data in aggregate is that the what is being monitored has to do with the ease at which it can be monitored, or the safety at which it can be monitored, right? Until relatively recently, it was actually really difficult to safely monitor without impacting the process elements of the industrial control environment. And I think you see that embedded in, no pun intended, embedded in this data, in that things that are more easily monitored or more traditionally monitored or have connectivity that can be monitored more easily are going to be elements of the control network that have active monitoring or even passive monitoring going on them. But nonetheless, I think what the trends would show, if we were to go back and ask this question several years ago, is that the collection number would be much slower or lower, and that my observation is that and you could probably comment on this from similar questions in the past, though, is that the trend is in a very good direction. The fact that some of these pieces of equipment have collection rates at 75% or 74% is really good. Obviously, it's not good that other high-risk areas have very low rate of monitoring. But at the same time, the trend over the long period, I think, is going in the right direction. And you could argue about what is driving that. Is that concern about escalating targeted threats around the ICS environment? Is it the availability of safe and reliable monitoring tools for ICS, or some combination thereof? But nonetheless, I think it's a very good trend. And I would anticipate, when you ask this question 18 months from now again, or 2 years from now, that the numbers around collection, those high numbers that are at the top of this chart, will begin to spread more closely down towards the bottom. And that's a good thing for our industry and for the reliability and uptime of the industries that are operating these systems.
Good points, Kim. I'm going to hold, Ilan, let you off the hook on this one, because I'm going to be calling on you on the next one as kind of the lead commentary. And this is for observation number 3. What we found in the results were that over 60% of the respondents think people are the key risk. when we ask them what is the element, whether it's people, process, technology, or other. And this one is kind of an interesting one because people is a very broad category. It can incorporate the people that actually are the intentional malicious threat actors and the unintentional non-malicious threat actors. It can include the people that make decisions on investment. It can include the people that make decisions around the operations. It's a very, very broad category. But one of the key points that we brought out in the paper is people. The people category is key because it's kind of the starting point. It's people that define the process, and then from there you can go on to the associated technology. And this also raised the interesting question when we looked at the results that most of the respondents felt that technology ranked higher than process as a risk category. So the question this kind of raises, and it may be kind of an esoteric question, but it's a very important one regardless, is how do people and organizations find that balance to make sure that their investment is appropriate across their people, their workforce, their processes, and the technology? And with that, I'd first like to turn to Elon for his thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a very interesting observation and a very interesting question. I think a few points regarding this issue. First of all, I think that the fact that we see all kinds of different potential attackers means that when we are designing our security model, we need to take into account what is the relevant attacker model for our kind of an organization, whether we are a target for a nation state or whether we are more in a target for a hacker, and according to that we can optimize our spendings. The other thing which is important is the internal versus external. I think it means that you need to take a lot of care about your internal network and not just assume that if you secure the perimeter that's enough. The third point is this balance between the technology, processes, and people. I think eventually you need to do something that is balanced between all of them in terms of combining them. So once you decide what you want to do and what you can do in terms of your budget on the technology side, then once you assimilate this kind of a solution, you need to make sure that you tie it with the right processes and the right training for the people so they know how to use these kind of tools. We have seen too many cases that people have deployed all kinds of advanced tools, but the people and the processes were missing in order to use it in the right way. And on the other end, also, if you don't plan to deploy a specific technology in the short term, you need to make sure that the people get the right training, that this is something that they need to take care of manually. And I think the last point is that eventually people, I think, will always be the weakest link in this kind of activities. So it's important to provide tools which will be enforcing some of the things that are related to the people, like not injecting USB ports and so on. But the more you can put this kind of technology that will help you make sure that the people are following the guidelines, I think that's an important aspect to make this kind of balance.
I think that's really good points, Elon. And I would say also that part of this all gets into the analysis piece in the front end, which is where most of my work, other than SANS, sits, is being able to learn how to define a good process and then be able to vet that it's a good process so you don't go about automating bad processes. Bad for a variety of reasons. It could be safety, it could be risk, it could be security, whatever. Kim, do you have any thoughts on the subject?
Wow, the thoughts on the subject of people and the risks that they present. Well, maybe I'll tell a story. Doug will remember this story, but we were together recently at a conference and I was on a panel, and one of the folks in the audience suggested that when he thought about, and this was an industrial control automation cybersecurity discussion, that which is a little different than the data that you have here around threats, but that if you compared the threat of nation states and the threat of organized crime, so let's say targeted attacks versus ransomware versus the risk presented by board night operators, that the board night operator presented a much higher risk than any of the nation states or crime syndicates that might be operating and thinking about attacking industrial production. which I thought was entertaining, if nothing else, but I think reflects the reality that humans are fallible, and that they don't intend to make mistakes, or they don't intend to create risk per se, but that it happens, and that is unlikely to change over time. You can train people, of course, and make them aware of that, but people are people, and that as the prior speaker, Justice Gill, just mentioned, having methods of monitoring for behavior that's unusual and being able to then quickly remediate it is a really strong way of using processes and technology to mitigate the risks of people. And that's something that we advocate, of course, as a method of, you can only train so much, right? And you still have risks that are in the system because humans are humans. So just those are a few of the comments that I would have in terms of the themes around the strong numbers here around people being the biggest risks.
I think those are good points. And just from a training standpoint, I am pretty deeply rooted right now in aviation, including cockpit automation. And I can speak fairly strongly to the fact that the training elements and the emphasis placed on training in that scenario is huge, especially from a safety perspective, not so much from a security perspective. So I think that one of the things in the ICS arena is I can see, and this may be a change for the IT security professional, there is a rebalancing of security and safety in looking at the overall risk profile.
Hey, Barb, I'd like to make a comment here as well, just playing off of Kim's very enlightening comments here. So the thought I have is the role of an operator within an industrial control system or an OT environment. It's so different today than it was, even a few years back, maybe even last year for some. It's a tough job. The workflows that they have to follow, what's expected of them for a lot of reasons, because we know technology has its march forward, but at the same rate, we can't miss the fact that there is an aging workforce that's already in place in industry and is starting to leave the industry. And those responsibilities don't just disappear. Somebody has to pick up on it. And a lot of these operators and automation professionals have to take on that responsibility. So process really matters. And thought occurs to me a lot that Murphy's Law says that bad things are going to happen at 2 a.m. on a Sunday, not 8 o'clock on a Monday when you are fully staffed and ready for incident response, so to speak. So it's really important as we think about increasing the skill set of today's operators and automation professionals that we realize that sometimes the things will happen at the wrong times when we don't want them, of course, and those that are in place to staff, they have to be equally prepared, or at least have means of escalating efficiently and have that be a practiced activity so we can continue to conduct business. So I want to bring that to the table of just how different and what the expectations are on the operators of today.
That's good points, Doug. And let's go on to the next slide, because I think that plays well into the fact that for our observation 4, and this was kind of a real change from our previous survey of a couple of years ago, the companies are relying more on internal trained staff. We're also seeing the budget between IT and OT being shared is kind of diminishing. It's basically separating into the two buckets, if you will. But that was kind of an interesting one, because as it would seem natural that as you look to an internal resource and you need to look at integrating IT and OT initiatives, that the budgets would tend to come together. They may have separate elements, but they would tend to have a convergence as opposed to be separating. So I think that this plays well to what Doug was talking about in terms of, automation coming more to the fore, aging workforce, and a reliance on internal staff, and the comment of whether, as companies are moving towards an internal workforce as opposed to outsourcing to vendors or service providers, what the impacts may be. So I think that this is more of a reflection on the comment, while IT and OT budgets appear to be separating, internal resource investments are increasing. And that would seem to want to bring a bridging process in place between IT and OT initiatives. And so for that, I'd like to ask Camillo what his thoughts are on this particular observation.
Yeah, I think it's important to see that, well, budgets, they tend to switch or stay on one side depending on the maturity of the organization and the stage of that organization, business stage, business cycle they are. So sometimes they see some more value of getting IT to oversee the OT, security space, but over the time they are coming to the realization it's important to have a specialization into this space, and then so that it is also reflected in a way by the switch of the budget, but also in terms of who is the owner. And you can see probably in the more mature organizations, the owner is normally the OT organization, not the IT, and they are as well as the owner of whatever are the policies in I guess reference guidelines that they have internally for use. In terms of the security capability, of course, the security capability is something that has to be built and maintained at all levels in an organization. And this particular one for me has to do with the organizations specializing in their threat hunting analysis internally, or doing it internally instead of externally. And there are several reasons for that, of course. And it has to do with the maturity of the organizations, how mature they are, and how much they can spend in terms of money to support that, to have that capability in-house or not. So, and it's a switch. We see everything in the market from our customers, from all ranges. And as I said, the main element that highlights to us is the maturity of the organization. But having the threat hunting capability in-house has helped some organizations to tie to other risk areas where, providers might not be able to enter, not IT. OT in many cases are closer in that case to the business that an IT could be in some organizations, to the core business, to the core risk business and discussions and so on. So I think from that perspective, having the threat analysis driven by the OT side is very important for the organizations. That's it for me.
Okay. Ilan, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, a few things about this point. I think, first of all, on one hand, the fact that it's more in the hands of the operations has some benefits, because we are pushing very much that you need to prioritize your risk mitigations based on the business processes and not just on the generic scoring of this risk. And once it's focused in the operations department, they know the best business processes, so they can decide in the right way what is more critical for them into their business processes, and not just based on the scoring that the systems might bring up. I think that the downside of this is that we have seen multiple cases in some of our customers in water, building management, and some others, where there is usually propagation between the IT and the OT. So once you are separating this IT and OT security, then you are not really securing or using this kind of monitoring for this kind of propagation. So it is a problem in this sense. And I think one other point which is interesting regarding the threat intelligence part, I think that relying on internal resources to be professional enough or trained enough, I think that's quite a risky point, because there are experts which are focusing on this and are collecting this information on a daily basis and making sure that it's up to date and what does it mean for different businesses and for different types of customers. So you need to reach out to these kind of sources and make sure that you get the best source of threat intelligence, which can also be used in order to do benchmarking. You don't just get a score of your risk, but you also can get some information about how is the industry for your specific vertical is doing, and how is it in your region, and so on. So I think that threat intelligence should be kept as an external source and not just rely on the internal stuff, no matter how trained they are.
I think those are excellent points, especially about the threat intelligence and threat hunting, and that is a recurrent theme in other aspects of security that we've seen. There are certain activities, pen testing, red team, blue team testing, where using external resources that can remain dedicated to the best pen testing techniques, knowledge of the industry, you don't have to put in there's not a cost benefit in most cases to maintaining that level of knowledge and recurrency internally, because it can be very expensive. Kim, do you have any more insights to add to this?
Sure, I have a couple insights actually on a couple topics that are represented in this particular set of data, and I'll start with threat intelligence because we're on that topic right now. But I would agree that threat intelligence is, while it's interesting that internal folks are doing some hunting, I think that's a good sign. And threat intelligence, by definition, is best shared across those that are seeing it, right? So if you aren't sharing threat intelligence, then all you know is what's happening to yourself, and you don't have visibility into what might be happening across a large cross-section of your industry or industrial control systems overall. So we're also advocates that threat intelligence is a really important part, and a broad-based set of threat intelligence is an important part of building an industrial control system cyber program. So I just wanted to make that comment. And then looking a little bit at some of the other data observations here, I'm going to maybe have some slightly different interpretations of that data based on what Nozomi sees from our deep market interactions with lots and lots of folks that are doing industrial control system cybersecurity. And I would start with the budget piece in particular, that the fact that the operations piece is growing, to me, is a sign that investments are being made in cybersecurity in operations areas, that it's a recognition that there is of A, the need, and B, it says people, you put your money where your mouth is, right? It says that organizations are not just talking about what they might do or what they plan to do, but that they are actually allocating funds so that they can put in place training, people, technologies that can help them address the threats and improve and ensure the reliability and the uptime of the assets that they're operating. So I think that that's a little bit how I see the budget aspects. We definitely are seeing lots of IT-OT collaborations, the sharing of data, which is off topic from this slide in particular, but we found that information sharing between IT and OT is one of the best ways to actually drive collaborative behavior that ultimately reduces risks across both of those communities. So I think those are a couple of the observations that I would make about the data here, and some of which is a little bit different than some of the conclusions you might have drawn.
Hey Kim, I'm going to pile on just a bit because I like your comment around threat intelligence, that community aspect, and what I think about is automation vendors, machine builders, integrators. We still have to realize that it's a competitive environment out there. Camilo and Yokogawa are awesome at what they do and highly competitive, and they win for very good reasons, as do other organizations. The reason why I bring this up is part of threat intelligence, information sharing. This is probably not the area that we should be looking at our competitors as competitors. We should probably be thinking about them as peers in our industry, as part of that community. And if we know something, pick up the phone and share that information, set the tone, and encourage that from others as well. So this is me kind of suggesting that as competitive as we are, let's not lose sight of the fact that we can all learn from each other, and let's compete in the playing fields that make sense too. So thanks for allowing me to make that comment.
I would add to that, Doug, is just that there are some mechanisms in place that make that easier too, right? Because things like the ICS CERT are fielding the research findings about vulnerabilities on, for example, automation equipment, and they're playing the role in the middle to ensure that rapid those vulnerabilities are patched as rapidly as possible, and then as soon as that happens, that the overall ICS community has information about that. So that's one example. Then, of course, there's many public forums for where signatures are being created or signatures are being curated and pumped into tools that help apply the hunt using technology that's looking for those signatures inside control networks. So, I think that this is a topic, threat intelligence is a topic that has to do with research and laboratory activity, as well as information sharing. And, there's also ISACs that are formed for the purpose of sharing information in certain industries. So there's, for those you that are on this webinar that are in the asset owner community, I'd be looking into your community for what are the methods of which information sharing is facilitated in a way that avoids competitive abrasion.
Yeah, and actually, I'm going to jump in here, Barb. There are, I'll call them use cases, but there are situations where that has happened, maybe not directly in a traditional ICS industry, but I can remember about 3 or 4 years ago, I went to an IEEE seminar out here where the CSO for Pfizer actually presented on cybersecurity in the pharmaceutical industry, which does have industrial controls and laboratory operations, and described a scenario where they were under global attack, and Pfizer and Merck and the major pharmaceuticals got together and actually worked in a collaborative space, not in terms of their intellectual property, which pharmaceuticals guard very closely, but able to come up with a global strategy for protection against this particular threat. It was a fascinating discussion, and it would be it would basically take what we're seeing develop to the next level. With that, Doug, I'd like to hand it back to you to field the Q&A, and if you have any further comments on the discussion.
Absolutely. We have a few questions that came in here. So let me advance the slide so we kind of land on this particular page. And if you have questions, if you're listening in, please submit them. We'll try to get to as many as we can. So here, let me address one that just came in. Is there a community where OT ICS threat intelligence is shared? I think we kind of hit on some of those highlights, but definitely a vibrant community made up of formal, structured organizations like the ISACs. If we look in North America, United States specifically, ICS CERT serves that role, but it also operates as a very global organization that many draw from, and quite frankly, just as a community, there's plenty of individuals. If you're listening to some of the social media outlets on LinkedIn and Twitter and whatnot, you'll pick up from many individuals that are doing outstanding work. They tend to amplify a lot of the materials and resources that are being posted that we can all draw from, and that happens in quite real time as well. So we probably didn't fully answer that question, but I think some elements came to the surface. Let me address this one, or at least ask the question of our team here. This comes from someone in the hydro industry. Let me just read this to you. I'm in the hydro industry. When we talk about cybersecurity to North American hydro utilities, many tell us their way of protecting their OT network is air gapping and keeping their OT network separate from the IT network and from the monitoring network created to utilize data for decision making. So here's the question. What are the cyber risks with this mindset and approach? So anybody want to take that one?
I'm laughing. Anyone else laughing? Not because, it's a serious question, but I think there was a famous ICS expert, I think it was Patrick Miller, who said, if you believe in air gapping, you also probably believe in unicorns. So because humans are involved, it's likely that air gapping is not really air gapped, would be kind of my one comment that I would make. But let's just assume that that is a successful strategy, and that when you go in and you set up your system to identify assets in that environment and identify all the connectivity, you determine that yes, you know what all your assets are in that environment, and yes, you know that there's no connectivity, if you believe that. I think the larger question is, well, what happens when you want to modernize that environment, right? What happens when you want to improve efficiency? What happens when that assumes that those hydro plants are going to stay the way they are for the next eternity, and I just don't believe that is the future that's before us, and I don't think that takes advantage of what digital transformation offers to our society to create more efficient energy, to create cleaner energy in the case of hydro, and if the reason for that sort of staying in the dark ages is out of fear of cybersecurity risks, I think that that's unfounded, and that there is an opportunity to learn more about ways in which modernization and digitization can go hand in hand with security.
All right. Camilo, I want to direct this one your way. This is more of a comment, but I think you can probably overlay a response to this. Standards like ISA 62443, I guess IEC 62443, don't talk about the cloud as part of the IACS. So that's a comment that came in. What are your thoughts around that for the cloud and maybe not being fully addressed or adequately addressed in the standard as written today?
Yeah, one thing that you will see, and you can notice now, some people are thinking that the standards are based solely on the definition of the ISA 95 functional levels, right? And from that standpoint of view, and of course, there are some organizations are afraid of connecting or even recognizing or realizing that they have connections to the cloud. But the standards are not necessarily blind to the reality. They are clear for it. So the conception of segmentation and zoning is clear, that could expand to virtual. So the elements of virtual networks are not ignored there. So cloud is a virtual network, it's an extension. And when you start reading the controls that you can find in 62443 related on how to work in those environments and how to secure those environments, how to secure your components to work in those environments, you will see that there are elements. So it's the standards are including both the physical and the virtual today. They're moving, of course, as I mentioned to you, more coming to the realization that when you move into a more virtual environment, your end devices, components, even applications can be now receiving a high level or greater exposure places with higher threat to you. And then that is also a realization that all these programs are working hard in embedding better security, not only in the devices. So 4.2 doesn't talk only about host devices, embedded devices, and network devices. They talk about how to secure applications. And the cloud environment, as we know, is heavily relied on the cloud, on applications. What are the important things that we need? And this is part of maturity. And from that standpoint of view, it's not only ISA 62443, which is looking into that. As I mentioned to you, OPAF, which is looking into the new generation of process automation systems, is fully aware of that and is also realizing the importance. But 62443 still is valid because it's defining what is that, what are those virtual clouds. There are, of course, other elements that you need to incorporate that are not traditional to security when you go into implementation. So there are elements that you need to have into account, like such as root of trust, secure boot, node identification. And all these elements that are traditional for cloud are also being incorporated into the standards today. So I don't think they are far. I think it's a constant, and everybody is realizing that it's important to secure those environments as well.
Great. Thank you for that insight. Elon, I'm going to direct this one your way. Here we go. We need to protect our system, but also make sure that people can maintain them. What's your advice?
Yeah, I think it's quite obvious that nowadays you need to allow maintenance, and if you will put too much security in the way of the maintenance, then probably people will just bypass it. So you need to make sure that the maintenance planning is done as part of the security. So if you have some maintenance cycle planned ahead, make sure that you configure it into the security tool so they will not alert too much about this kind of planned activities. And then you can merge the maintenance and the security together and make sure that it's not something that is blocking your efficient operations, but it's actually something that is supporting it, and you can even use it to finalize and approve your maintenance cycle.
That's great comment. I think we have time for one more here. Kim, I'm going to direct this one your way. A lot of attacks start with phishing and come in through business systems. Why not just block off control systems instead of allowing remote access?
Well, I don't think that that's necessarily going to prevent targeted phishing attacks too, right? So there's been some proven attacks where highly targeted phishing is a very difficult task to eliminate. But I guess I'd sort of go back to the original, the theme of my prior comment around, we need the business systems, right? We need the business systems for a wide range of reasons, and eliminating the connectivity between those two is a little bit like moving to the air gapping method. If you're looking to optimize the interaction between the needs of your customers, for example, from a production perspective, and your ability to do production, you of course have to have some level of connectivity that's happening between those two systems. And I think that the trends around using business analytics in order to improve the productivity and even in some cases maybe the safety of a company's operation are not, that the train's left the station there, I guess. That's well underway, and that the benefits of that are extraordinary, whether it's for improving predictive maintenance and therefore using business analytics to do that in order to be able to therefore have a more resiliency and more uptime or more productivity, are all attributes of an operation that are very desirable. And that there's so that's one element. The other, I think, element of the quote business systems, and in this case I'm going to use IT security as an example, and maybe it's a little bit off topic, but it's clear to me, and I think to probably you would agree, that the cybersecurity owners for a large organization, whether it's an oil and gas company or refinery, a utility, mine, pick one, the board of directors is asking, are we secure? That question is being asked of the security organization in that company, and they have to have visibility into what's happening in their operation in order to be able to answer that question. And they have to be doing the types of security practices that they've had on the IT side and have matured those for a decade. So the opportunity to have visibility and have really good security analytics about the nature of the threat inside their operation, which, by the way, could have a catastrophic effect on the company overall if there were an incident, needs to be incorporated in the overall cybersecurity management and risk management of the whole organization. And that means that there has to be connectivity that's happening in that way. So one of the pieces of advice that I often give companies that are thinking about their OT cybersecurity programs is make sure that you're integrating what you're doing on the OT side. You choose tools and techniques and train people in a way that they understand OT environments, but make sure that you're integrating with the existing security tools like your SIEMs that might be in place or your asset management capabilities, so that ultimate owner of security across the organization can have a complete view of the security posture of their organization, including the operations, which could have more business impact than any other part of the organization if there were an incident. So that's a little piece of advice that I wanted to leave as a kind of a parting note on this webinar.
Thanks so much for that, Kim. Really appreciate it. All right, I think we hit a few questions. I know a few have also come in. We'll try to address those after the webcast directly. But to close this out, first I'd like to extend a thank you to Barb for just great leadership throughout the webcast today at sharing those data points and guiding our panelists into the discussion. I also want to just re-extend a big thank you to our sponsors, to Nozomi, Radiflow, Yokogawa, and certainly to Kim, Elon, and Camillo for taking time out of their very busy schedules. Hopefully everybody that attended today got some value, hopefully a lot of value. Just a reminder, please do check out the ICS survey results. I think hopefully as you take a look, you'll draw some of your own interesting conclusions in addition to what you've heard today. And with that, basically we're done. And Carol, I'm going to hand it back to you to take us out.
All right. Thank you so much, Doug, Barbara, Kim, Alon, and Camilo for your great presentation. And to Nozomi Networks, Radiflow, and Yokogawa for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.